technology in and of itself is a wonderful thing, and it depends how we harness it, and it depends what we do with it, and the intention behind it, and the context. And the problem is that we've got a technocratic elite that we've had for a very long time now, for several decades, that think generally the public is mad, bad, and dangerous. We're an infection of sorts. And what we saw during lockdowns and COVID.
How can you say that? But that's an opinion, isn't it? It's not necessarily.
I think it is. I'll give you some examples as to why I think that is. If you look at the debate around Brexit, anyone who had a view about pro-Brexit, for instance, were often presented as gammons, as white van man, a bit like Hillary Clinton talked about deplorables, as though they're the great.
The elite, presumably, that's just from people with opposing views.
That since probably at least since Tony Blair and Cameron, but actually pre that, in post-war period, James Burnham talks about managerialism and about a technocratic class that is obsessed with control and implementing things in a certain way. Now, if you're a bureaucrat and you want efficiency and you want stats and you want evidence, and all those things could be really good, right? They're important human words. But if you think that the problem of beds, for instance, in a hospital is too many people, or coffin dodgers, or that we've got too much strain on nature, you might be deciding to do things in a certain way. Or if you think it's another reason because of how you've got a sclerotic NHS with too much bureaucracy, or perhaps you're not running it efficiently enough, you might do different things. The point I'm making is that the elite, and there's a split between the elite. There's an older elite, a new elite, but the bureaucrat, technocrat, globalist elite that I'm talking about, who's in the ascendancy at the moment, but are being challenged, have for quite some time had, in my opinion, and it is an opinion, a very anti-ordinary person view. The idea that...
Who are these elite? Who are they?
Yeah, let me give you an example. You mentioned the Tony Blair Institute as there's now like a very good example of someone who lied to the demos, to the public, about going to war. That every issue that comes up, his answer seems to be digital ID. This is not a new debate. Winston Churchill in 1952 said we're going to not have national identity cards. It's not the British way. That's not being free. And like with free speech, there's often some people who think that the people have too much of it and we should restrict it. And that's been going on since the Constitution. But at different points, and particularly in the post-World War period and in the post-Cold War period in particular, the idea that the public is a dangerous mob and shouldn't be trusted, particularly as Labour has unhinged itself. It has no relationship with the working everyday people anymore. It's much more of a cosmopolitan elite. But it should be said that David Cameron and others tried to emulate those things. And there was a rift. There's a big gap between most of the new elite and the public. Public needs, interests, wants. Now, in that context, what we've seen happen, like, for instance, lockdowns, the only real precedent, the only real first thing that was done around the world, but in Britain, let's talk about Britain, where the idea was that we're all going to need to be made quiet, hands on heads, and locked away. We were told to follow the science because the smart people were doing that, but the stupid public who would just infect one another, they needed to be controlled. And one of the ways to do that was to have a vaccine passports, digital ID. Now, if there had been an approach that took the public seriously and engaged honestly and said, we're not sure about some of these things, but actually we think, looking at what's going on, vulnerable and very old people may be significantly at risk. Let's take a strategy to do with that. But the rest of the public can be out and trusted and go to work, keep the economy running. By the way, that's how we keep the NHS going and all the other things. A bit like they did in Sweden and then later on in Florida and Texas and elsewhere. Then that would have been an approach that perhaps took the public more seriously. And I guess that we could talk about lots of issues in lots of areas of the political life today. But I think the view that, and we'll go on to talk about it here, in a range of areas, we see that there's a contempt for the public often, that when they vote incorrectly, they're told to go back and do it again, or they didn't understand it, or they were lied to, or they were confused, as though somehow the great elite need to prescribe what's done. And in that context, all of these concerns around digital ID, around control, nudge, imposition, restrictions, limits, and we can talk about how they play out, whether it's to do with streets and roads, whether it's to do with surveillance, whether it's to do with banking and free speech. But in a range of these areas, the premise is this, and let's take free speech as it. The public are not to be trusted. You can't have a conversation about borders or migration or Southport or Dover or more recently in Epping without many people saying they're far right, they're outrageous, they're dangerous, perhaps they should be imprisoned for social media posts. Where other people who are saying various things, who are doing violent acts or even attacking people, get even shorter sentences. Now, in that context, as we started off, when I say there's been two-tier approach and policing and weaponizing of the judiciary, because often the elite, the new elite, think the public are scum, there are many examples we could give to that, right? But even if they didn't think all that, Lucy, right? Even if they were really into the public and fantastic, the concerns we have about digital ID, like with free speech, is that once you start implementing measures, even if people are very benevolent and nice, you create a situation which then leaves space for anyone then subsequently to do anything. And we need to ring fence and protect and uphold our liberties and our privacy and our rights. And that's the point about this digital Bill of Rights.